So good morning, everybody, and welcome to Arts and Design Fridays. My name is Susan Moffett, and I am Creative Director of Future Histories Lab and Executive Director of the Global Urban Humanities Initiative. And on behalf of Lisa Wymore, who is Head of Berkeley Arts and Design, and myself, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to both all of our students and our public audience, and also our audience on Zoom. We are really excited to have with us today Ed Tepporn, who is Executive Director of the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. He'll be talking about preventing erasure at the Angel Island Immigration Station and talk about the history and also about how this station was saved. I want to make sure that our public audience knows that this is part of a larger project called A Year on Angel Island. And we have a year of performances, exhibitions, courses, public talks, and creative projects, all of which use Angel Island and the Angel Island Immigration Station as a jumping off point, as an observatory from which to think about issues of migration, othering, and belonging, and especially of thinking of how the arts can both help us understand these issues and perhaps bring about some better futures. So this session today is both a public talk and a class. This is Humanities 20, Landscapes of Migration, Incarceration, and Resistance. And so first I need to go over a little bit of housekeeping and announcements for our students. And so if our public audience could listen along as we do that, we will very soon get to our public speaker, Ed Tepporn. So some of the announcements I have for the class are to thank the students who came on the wonderful field trip to Angel Island on Saturday. I think it was a really moving experience for all of us, and we had a fantastic docent whose father had come through Angel Island himself, and the stories he told us inside the detention barracks really, I think, help us understand what we're talking about throughout this semester. For the students who went on that field trip, I have a thank you card for Joe Chan, our docent. So after class, if you could come up and sign that, that would be great. I also want to announce just a couple of events that may be of interest, both to students and to our public audience, on themes of identity and colonialism and cultural appropriation and kind of hipster foodie culture. There is a new play at the Aurora Theater in downtown Berkeley called Colonialism is Terrible, but Pho is Delicious. And it is looking at these issues through the lens of humor, and students, I will see if I can get us some discount tickets, because I think that this will enrich our discussions about what we've been talking about. I also want to mention, since in this course we're talking about landscape and memory and how both the designed landscape and the natural landscape can either hide or reveal history and memory, Andy Shankin, professor of architectural history at UC Berkeley, who has been a very important part of the Global Urban Humanities Initiative and has shaped a lot of our thinking about monuments and memory, will be in conversation this Tuesday by Zoom, so you can attend. The time here says 7:30, that's East Coast time. So at 4:30 Pacific time, you can hear him talk in conversation about his new book, The Everyday Life of Memorials, with Paul Farber, who is head of Monument Lab. Monument Lab in Philadelphia is doing all kinds of very interesting work on monuments, memorials, and how to rethink how we represent history in public space. So those are two things that I wanted to announce. And then I also wanted to let folks know that we are moving ahead with our Townsend Working Group on Angel Island, which is working all through the fall to create a storytelling art performance project that will be at Angel Island in the spring, and we are meeting Wednesdays from 10 to 12. If you go to the storytelling square on our homepage, there's information if you'd like to participate or get involved in some way. One thing I'd really like to reach out to both our students and our public audience about is we would love to have folks involved whose ancestors came through Angel Island. We really want this to be collaborative storytelling. We want to help people tell their own stories because the ownership of stories is important. So if you have or think you might have an ancestor who was processed through Angel Island, and you'd like to get involved in some way, it could be small, it could be large, but we'd love to talk with you. So please go to the Storytelling Square and you can click through and there's contact information there. We would love to have collaborators who have close ties to Angel Island. I also want to thank students for all of your wonderful weekly reflections. I haven't been able to respond to all of them, but I have been reading them all. And the way that you have been connecting what our speakers are talking about to your own histories and making connections among the themes that the speakers have been addressing, I really value and appreciate how thoughtful you've been in those comments. And, you know, along those lines, if you want to dig deeper in these issues, I really want to encourage you to look at our affiliated courses, because this course, Humanities 20, it's a one-unit speaker course. We're just touching on issues that you can really dig into very deeply. And so I want to highlight that next spring, there's some really great courses where you can dig in depth into Asian American history, and including a course that I think is very useful, Victoria Robinson's An Introduction to Abolition Pedagogy and Practice, Ethnic Studies 22 AC. Take a look at these courses, and also in your planning for next year, take a look at our Fall 22 courses. It's already probably too late for you to join any of these classes, but you may want to take some of these courses next year if the themes in this class interest you. And there are courses on Mexican immigration, on immigration law, on social justice, art. I really encourage you to dig in to these courses. I also want to highlight that in the spring, we will continue our public programs we're going to go in two kind of directions. One is poetry, the other is policy. And in terms of the policy side of things, we're going to have Erica Lee, who wrote the book, literally wrote the book on Angel Island. She's going to be one of our speakers in a series organized by Letty Volpe at the law school. So our conversations will continue in the spring, be digging into legal issues, and also we will have a number of poetry events, and I invite you to look at those. Finally, in terms of housekeeping today, one thing I would like to ask students is to think about some good questions for our speaker, Ed Tepporn. And I know folks have been just a little bit shy about asking questions. So today, I gave you an extra index card. So you need to turn in your one regular index card with the takeaway and the question. But if you have a question that you would like to ask Ed Tepporn today, if you don't feel like raising your hand and speaking into the mic, feel free to write it on a card and hand it to the usher, and they can read it for you. Or once you write it down, you might realize, oh, hey, I could read this myself. Either way is fine, but I just want to make sure that you have a chance to be in conversation with Ed. So I'm going to close out some of these tabs. Oh, the other thing that I want to make sure that people know about is our research guides. And these are available to the public too, as well as students. But if you want to research family history, the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation has fantastic family research guides and resources. So we have links to those there. And there's just a lot of information on from other sources as well on how to access archives and family history. So I encourage everyone to take a look at that. Okay, so now we'll move into our main event. I'll be introducing Ed Tepporn in a minute. But I want to start our session today by acknowledging, as we always do, that here in Berkeley we are in the territory of Huichin, which is the ancestral homeland of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, who are still very much among us and active in leadership of the community. And I also want to acknowledge that the place that we're engaging with, Angel Island, is in the territory of the Coast Miwok people. And if folks are interested in learning more about that, we have a recording that will be up very soon on both the Arts and Design website and our Future Histories Lab website. That was our first session in this series. That was a talk by Greg Saris, who is chairman of the Federated Indians of the Great Rancheria and representing the Coast Miwok people. So we had a whole session about the indigenous history of Angel Island, and I encourage everybody to take a look at that. So in order to situate today's talk, since we are very place-based in our approach here, I want to take us back to the question of islands. And last week with Lenora Lee and Ava Roy, art theater directors and dance directors who created works of art on Alcatraz and Angel Island, we were talking about the ways that these two neighboring islands are places of incarceration and potentially of liberation. They were places of activism by Native Americans and Asian Americans. So these are two islands side by side. But I'd like to draw our attention to another island that is in the news just recently, and that is the island called Martha's Vineyard. And I wonder, has anybody in this room been to Martha's Vineyard? Yeah. So Martha's Vineyard is a little island off the coast of Massachusetts. It's where people like to go for vacation, wealthy people who use summer as a verb, summer there. And this is the place, of course, where Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida has decided to send a lot of immigrants from Venezuela who were in Texas. And he invited them onto a plane and sent them up to Martha's Vineyard and just dropped them off there without them knowing where they were going and without anybody on Martha's Vineyard knowing they were coming. So there are two things about this. One is, this is a political move. Ron DeSantis hopes to challenge Donald Trump for the Republican nomination for the presidency. Clearly, he thinks that this is going to be a popular move, that it's a rhetorical move that is going to be effective. It's certainly getting a lot of attention. And so I think what we need to think about is why does this work? Why does he think people would like this idea? Well, he's following in a tradition that has been going on a long time in the United States, that is nativist, that is portraying immigrants and refugee seekers as dangerous, dirty, and all of the things that were said about the Chinese and the other Asian immigrants who are coming to Angel Island. So if you attend the Angel Island Oratorio, which is also part of our program in December, you'll hear the voice, you'll hear a reading of a 19th century California politician saying basically the same things that are being said about immigrants today. So there's this long tradition of this kind of rhetoric. And so in this class, and I hope in other classes, you'll have a chance to explore the history of this so that we can understand better how we might treat people more like human beings in the future. The other thing about Martha's Vineyard is it raised for me the question of, what is an island? What is the significance of an island? A lot of us now hear island, it's like vacation, Martha's Vineyard, Hawaii, Bahamas. Island sounds tropical and relaxing, but islands have been places of exile, places that were scary, places where we sent people that we didn't want to see. And that was the case of Angel Island because, of course, it started first as a quarantine station before it was an immigration station. And, we can think of St. Helena. Napoleon was exiled to this island in the middle of the Atlantic off the coast of Africa. In Japan, Sado Island was a place where people out of favor were sent to a windy, lonely island. Nauru in the South Pacific is a place where Australia today is sending its immigrants and detainees who it doesn't want to have on its mainland. So islands are about sending people away. And where is away? So we don't have to think about them, people who we don't want to be near us. And yet, I just want to point out that there are islands in the middle of our communities that are invisible, that we don't see. So for example, when Lenora Lee was talking about the deportation of so many Cambodian refugees and immigrants in the Bay Area, that was something that I didn't know about. It was happening right here. And I would also point out that, the detention centers for migrants are all over the world. So we need to think about Angel Island and its history in the context of what's happening today. So for example, this is a map put together by the Global Detention Project. Right here there's a detention center in Pleasant Hill. ICE has a detention center in Richmond, the West County Detention Center. that is invisible to most people, but it's a place where there are serious issues of inhumane treatment of detainees. But these are just a few of the places. If you zoom out, there are detention centers all over the United States where immigrants and refugees are held, and all over the world, really. So as we think about Angel Island, it's not just one place, and it's not in the past, it's something that's happening today. This is the context in which Ed Tepporn is going to explain the Angel Island Immigration Station and the storytelling that's happening around it. In order to introduce Ed, I'd like to say, first of all, that we are so pleased to have Ed and the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation as our partner in A Year on Angel Island, and we're working together on a lot of research and creative projects together, and it's been such a pleasure working with Ed and his organization, and we look forward to the rest of the year and beyond. Ed Tepporn joined the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation as executive director in November 2019, right before the start of the pandemic. And he has over 25 years of experience in the nonprofit sector, mostly in public health. He previously served on the staff at the Asian Pacific Islander American Health Forum for nearly 16 years, most recently as their executive vice president. And he also served as director of education at St. Louis Effort for AIDS and as community co-chair of Missouri's statewide HIV/STD prevention community planning group. Ed does a lot of work in storytelling, which connects his past work in public health to his present work in public history and activism. For example, he co-developed the 9-month Health Rising Leadership Institute, which has trained more than 50 Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders to become stronger leaders and storytellers. Ed received a BA in biology and psychology from Washington University and studied social work at the George Warren Brown School at WashU. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Ed Tepporn.
Let me just make the screen a little bit bigger so that you all can see it. And first of all, thank you, Susan, for that wonderful introduction. It has been such a pleasure to work alongside the Future Histories Lab and the Arts and Design Initiative on this year on Angel Island. And I think it is another great example of how nonprofit institutions and academic institutions can partner together to not only preserve histories, but to uplift them and to connect the dots to how they are relevant to today. I, as Susan mentioned, have had the privilege of serving as the executive director for the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, which is the primary nonprofit partner working with California State Parks to preserve the buildings at Angel Island, which is a California historic landmark as well as a national historic landmark. And our role is to help fundraise to preserve the buildings, to maintain them, but also to be a partner in ensuring that these histories are not forgotten. As I think about these histories, what I often really start with, as Susan mentioned, is where it all began. And so Angel Island is located on the ancestral lands of the Coast Miwok, whose descendants are now known as a federally recognized tribe of the Grattan Rancheria. And when I say that, as an Asian American, as an immigrant, as a gay person, it's a reminder to me that as much as I want my community's histories and stories to be seen and heard and valued, it's just as important that I learn about the histories and stories and the realities of our sibling communities, whether that is the indigenous communities, whether that is Black communities, Latino, Latinx communities, differently abled communities. Because the reality is that our histories are intertwined. And while we have all experienced different degrees of oppression, of injustice, and they all take their own shape and form, in so many ways, the way that we remember our histories and their influence to today shapes how we can think about a future that is more welcoming and more inclusive for us all. And so I want to pose the question to all of you, because for so many of our communities, there has been this long history generations of being made to feel invisible, being made to feel less than welcome, being made to feel othered. So however you identify, I want you to just take a few moments to think about, when was the first time that you were made to feel like you didn't belong or that you were different? I'll tell you a little bit about my first time. It starts with my grandparents. My grandparents immigrated from China to Thailand. My parents were the first on both sides to have the opportunity to go to college. And that, after the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965, created new pathways for immigrants to come here who were deemed to have high skills that our country might want, created an opportunity for my parents to immigrate to the US. And so when my mom was pregnant with me, they actually flew back to Thailand because at first they didn't feel welcome and they weren't sure how long they were going to stay here. So they wanted me to be born with Thai citizenship. So I was born in Bangkok, Thailand, with the name Tian Chai Tepporn Borasuthi. After a few months, my parents returned back to the US and I stayed with my grandmother, who raised me up until I was about a year and a half old. And then I flew with my grandmother to Houston, Texas, and that's where I grew up. So as an Asian immigrant growing up in Texas in the 70s and 80s, my family and I definitely experienced our share of racism and xenophobia. My parents in particular, because they spoke English with an accent. But it was an incident in fourth grade where I realized for the first time that I wasn't seen, similar to the majority of my friends who were white identifying, because I was an Asian immigrant. And so imagine this, it's fourth grade. The thing that every fourth grader looks forward to is this week away from school where you go to an outdoor education camp and you're away from the classroom, you don't have any homework, you're away from your parents. And so this was something that every fourth grader looked forward to. I remember getting on that big yellow bus with its green seats and its sticky floors and was so giddy with the thought of being at an outdoor camp with my friends. And as soon as our bus arrived at that outdoor education camp, we were assembled on the baseball fields with the other schools. And they started calling out our cabin assignments one by one. And at first I didn't notice anything, and it wasn't until one of my friends said under his breath, "This is so wrong." I had no idea what was going on, and I asked him, "What's so wrong?" And then it dawned on me, as they continued calling out the names, that all the white students were being put into one set of cabins, and all the people of color students like me were being put into another set of cabins. And that's the first time, explicitly, as a fourth grader, I remembered feeling different. Now, your memory of feeling different or feeling like you were made to not belong might be in a different environment. It might be in a different community. But I bet that all of us have at least one of those incidents in our lives where we were told we were less than, we were told that we didn't fit in. We might have been told to go back to where we came from. And I hope it's that empathy for that experience that as we think about what immigrants experience today and how many immigrants continue to be made to feel like they don't belong, that there's a little bit of shift. And there's a shift in how we treat immigrants, both from a policy perspective as well as a community perspective. And I think that Angel Island's history of what Asian immigrants in particular experienced in detention at Angel Island, the immigration policies that they were subject to, is an important reminder of the ways that our country, unfortunately, has systematized and made people feel like they don't belong. Just to give you a little bit of a roadmap of our time together, I've got 4 different sections for my time with you today. First, I do want to delve into a little bit more of the history of Angel Island because it is a history that is still often untold. Growing up in Texas, I definitely never learned about Angel Island in school. And even living out here in the Bay Area for almost 22 years, I'd heard about Angel Island. I knew its significance, but I never visited. And so I just wanted to see by a show of hands, how many of you have visited Angel Island before? That's great. Thank you. And for those of you who have not raised your hands, don't feel bad, but I definitely encourage you to do so. I actually didn't visit Angel Island until I was interviewing for this position. But once I visited, I realized in walking on this sacred ground, in walking on this place where history happened, that you can't help but feel the history. You can't help but feel the emotions. And you can't help but think about what immigrants experienced then and now when you set foot on Angel Island. So for all of you who haven't raised your hands, I hope that by the end of this presentation, I give you extra encouragement and incentive to visit soon. What I'll also have an opportunity to share a little bit more about, and granted this predates my time with the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, is just everything it took to make sure that these buildings at Angel Island remain standing. I also want to spend a little bit of time connecting history to current day narratives about Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And then finally, I want to give you a glimpse of what you have to look forward to when you visit Angel Island. So let me start by saying this. The racism and xenophobia that we are seeing around the country today, especially over the past couple of years, is unfortunately not new. It has deep roots dating back to when Asians and Pacific Islanders first started coming to the US. And for the Chinese community in particular, this was about the mid-1800s after the discovery of gold. We saw many Chinese laborers who saw an opportunity to potentially make a new pathway for themselves and for their families, who would come over here with the dreams of sending money back home to support their families and their villages back there. And so we saw these first huge waves of Chinese Americans come to the US during the mid-1800s. After the gold rush ended, many of these laborers stayed on to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. And it was them, along with Italian immigrants who worked on the railroad from the East Coast, that then met in the middle. And there's that famous picture, right, of the golden spike being laid. And if you look closely, it's really hard to find the Chinese immigrants who helped support the building of that railroad, which was backbreaking work. It was dangerous work. Many of the immigrants and laborers lost their lives. They weren't even allowed to ride the railroad back as they sought to make their way back to towns and cities across the western coast of the US. They had to find their own way. And once they reached these towns and cities, unfortunately, as you see on the screen, they were met with a lot of racism and xenophobia. They were seen as threats to the economy. They were seen as threats to scarce jobs. And unfortunately, many communities experienced arson, mob riots, lynchings, and that's what's depicted in these paintings. This racism and xenophobia and this violence ultimately made its way into our country's immigration policies. And so on the left-hand side of the screen is a newspaper article headline that is announcing the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which marked the first time in our nation's history that a country's people were kept from becoming US citizens and its laborers were kept from entering the US. There were a couple of exceptions. So if you were rich, if you were a diplomat, if you were a business owner, if you were a teacher or student, those were some of the loopholes where you could still come and enter the US, but you could not become a US citizen. And the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first, but it was definitely not the last. In the decades that followed, you see on the right-hand side of the screen a whole litany of other immigration laws and policies that essentially collectively expanded this exclusion to include almost all countries from Asia and the Pacific. The exceptions were if you were a US territory or possession. For those of you who are not from the Bay Area or who are watching it and not in the Bay Area and aren't familiar with where Angel Island is located, on the lower right-hand side of the screen, you see a picture of San Francisco Bay. So Angel Island is definitely on the West Coast. And on the left-hand side is a zoomed-in picture of Angel Island. Angel Island is 750 acres. The land where the immigration station is located sits on about 15 to 20 acres, which is about the same size as Alcatraz, though Alcatraz definitely sees many more visitors than the Angel Island immigration station does. Here's just another example. This is a quote from Dr. M.W. Glover, who was one of the officials that oversaw the Public Health Service, which operated the hospital building at the U.S. Immigration Station at Angel Island. I'm not going to read this quite out loud, but you can tell from what's written here, from these words, that there is a sense of inherent racism, of xenophobia, that stereotyping of Asians as being dirty and disease-bearing, which was then projected on Asians, and it's a pervasive stereotype that we're seeing today projected onto other groups of immigrants. But just imagine if the administrators, if the officials who are overseeing a hospital building on the immigration station held these types of views, what were the policies and procedures like? How were the immigrants treated? I'll give you a little bit of an example. Over the next couple of slides, what you'll see are two sets of pictures on each screen. On the left-hand side is a historic image of what the immigration station used to look like, and on the right-hand side is a current-day picture. So there's two events that really triggered more and more waves of Chinese immigrants in particular, and then later Asian Pacific Islander immigrants wanting to come to the US. So the first was in 1898, there was a Supreme Court case of the US versus Wong Kim Ark, which established birthright citizenship. Anyone born in the US is considered a US citizen. And then the second event is the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906, which was devastating. Many people lost their lives and their homes and possessions. And that earthquake and fire ultimately destroyed many of the administrative buildings in San Francisco that was where birth records were kept. So this created this window of opportunity despite these exclusionary immigration policies, where Chinese laborers who had been born in China came forward and said, I'm actually a US citizen, I was born here. And when asked for proof of that, they said, my birth records burned down in the fire. And so there was no proof to say that they weren't not telling the truth. There was also immigration policies at the time that if you were a US citizen and you had sons and daughters born abroad, that they could also come over to the US. And this created this practice of what was known as paper sons and daughters, where the individuals would purchase these false alleged identities of these sons and daughters of these US citizens. It's cost a lot of money back then to do this. For example, it was about $100 for each year of age of the claimed identity. So if I was claiming the identity of a 15-year-old boy, it would have cost about $1,500 back then to purchase that document, as well as a coaching book that described the fictitious details of this person's lives. So I'll come back to that in just a second. But with these two events, we saw increasing waves of Chinese as well as immigrants from across Asia and the Pacific coming to the US. And the US government decided that given the success of Ellis Island on the East Coast, they needed an immigration station on the West Coast. So in 1910, a US immigration station was built at Angel Island. The officials referred to it as the Guardian of the West. It's also been called the Ellis Island of the West. And I think that name is a little bit of a misnomer, in that when I think of the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, I think of them as symbols of how our country has welcomed immigrants, although detention and exclusion did happen there as well. Whereas Angel Island really is more of a reminder of exclusion and detention. And so that's where the name doesn't necessarily fit. So let's transport ourselves back in time to 1910. Back then, it would take about 2 to 3 weeks to cross the ocean on an ocean liner. If we happened to have money and means, then we perhaps were traveling in the privacy and security and comfort of first-class cabins. But for many of these immigrants, they were traveling in second class or third class in steerage in very cramped and crowded and smelly conditions. And so put yourselves into the shoes of one of those immigrants. Perhaps our family or our village pulled together the money to buy that one ticket for us to come to the US, to buy that one paper son document or paper daughter document to come to the US. Imagine the weight of responsibility that you felt on your shoulders. And after 2 to 3 weeks of being in these cramped and crowded conditions, you finally make your way in to San Francisco Bay, which we know is just as pretty now as it probably was back then. But unfortunately, we weren't allowed to depart the boat. Instead, the immigration officials would step onto the ocean liners, For the first-class passengers, they would have a review of their paper documents and a very cursory medical exam. And in most cases, those first-class passengers were allowed to depart directly to San Francisco, even if you were Chinese, if you were one of those exempt classes, unless they didn't believe who you said you were. For other immigrants, though, if they thought that you were from one of these exempt countries, if they thought that you might have one of the excludable medical conditions that might have been a public health threat or that's on the list of diseases that would keep someone from being allowed to enter the US, or if they thought that you would be someone who might be likely to become a public charge, someone who wouldn't be able to be self-sufficient and become reliant on the government for support, then you were put onto a ferry to Angel Island. And the view that you see on the left-hand side is what you would have seen as soon as you stepped foot on the Angel Island. On the left is what was the administration building. And this is where, as immigrants, we would walk down this 150, 200-foot pier. We would have an initial processing, and then we would begin our experiences of segregation and detention. There were 3 layers of segregation that happened on Angel Island that started from the moment that you arrived on the docks and carried with you throughout your entire time at Angel Island. Men were separated from women, Asians were separated from non-Asians, and then the Chinese were separated from each other. If I was a young boy traveling with my mother and I was over the age of 12 years old, then I would have been separated from her and had to stay with the other men and boys, and I would not be allowed to interact or see her while I was detained on Angel Island. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll notice that the building that you see is actually the former detention barracks where men and boys were held. The administration building that's on the left-hand side of the screen burned down in a fire in 1940. And after that building burned down, the site stopped being used as an immigration station. But because the buildings, including the hospital building as well as these detention barracks, were still standing, then the US Army took the site back over and used it during World War II to house enemy POWs, as well as about 700 Japanese Americans who were classified as enemy aliens immediately after Pearl Harbor. And they were classified as enemy aliens because they were thought to have stronger ties to Japan than the US, simply because they were reporters or foreign officials or martial artists or photographers or journalists. And it's really important to note that we still don't have any shred of evidence that any of these 700 Japanese Americans committed any type of espionage during World War II or afterwards. So after your initial entrance into the administration building and your initial processing, what would then happen would be a medical screening. And if you were thought to have any of the medically excludable conditions like tuberculosis, trachoma, hookworm, liver flukes, then you were sent to the hospital building for a more invasive medical exam. And we know that the predominant stereotype back then was that Asians were the ones who were susceptible to diseases because they were dirty. And so Asian immigrants actually experienced more invasive medical exams than European immigrants. Asians were forced to strip completely naked and to provide blood and stool samples so that the doctors could check for any of these communicable diseases. The other piece to keep in mind from an Asian medical perspective is in Asian medical and holistic healing practices back then and even now, you don't disrobe in front of another person. You typically remain fully clothed. And so for women in particular, to have to fully disrobe in front of, most of the doctors were male, it was remembered as a very traumatic and humiliating experience. Also, many doctors here in the US then and now wear white lab coats, whereas in China back then, white is actually the color of death. So imagine you come into these medical examinations, you're forced to go against social taboos that you're not used to, and then you don't speak the language, and then you're presented face to face with this person who is telling you to disrobe. It was a very triggering and traumatic experience for many immigrants. And indeed, many of the people who were detained on Angel Island did not like to talk about their experiences of being detained because they were so traumatic. On the left-hand side is a historical photo. We believe it's a staged photo because different from the historical accounts that immigrants have provided, these men are semi-dressed. On the right-hand side is a picture of what the hospital building looks like now as the Angel Island Immigration Museum. And I'll show you a few more pictures of that in just a bit. The other difference between how Asian immigrants were treated compared to European immigrants is that Asian immigrants typically had much longer periods of detention, typically a couple of days to a couple of weeks. Chinese in particular often were detained on Angel Island for a couple of months. The longest period of detention was a Chinese woman named Kwok Shi, who spent almost 2 years in detention before she was actually deported and didn't have the opportunity to enter the US. Compare that to European immigrants at Ellis Island, who often only spent a handful of hours before they were quickly admitted. There were European immigrants who came through Angel Island. They typically spent a couple of days on Angel Island. And so it's important to recognize that Angel Island is not just a Chinese experience. It's not just a Japanese experience. It's not just an Asian Pacific Islander experience. Indeed, the majority of immigrants who were detained on Angel Island or processed through Angel Island were from China and Japan. Those were the two largest groups because of the immigration policies at the time. But people from over 80 different countries were processed or detained during the 3 decades that Angel Island was open. And there were about 500,000 immigrants that we're aware of that were processed or detained through Angel Island. The picture on the right-hand side just shows you the cramped and crowded conditions, a recreation of what it was like for these immigrants in detention. You didn't know how long you would be in detention. If you were a male, you were only allowed opportunities to go outside twice a day. Women and children did have an opportunity to walk around the site under chaperoned visits. But in rooms that were sometimes supposed to only hold 50 people, there might be sometimes as many as 200 people crammed into these rooms. There were separate dining facilities for Asians and Europeans, and there are many historical accounts that talk about how bad the food tasted. We know that the immigration officials also spent more money on the European meals than they did for the Asian meals. And then finally, the major difference is these boards of special inquiry, which were really just lengthy interrogations. They weren't physically violent, but they were grueling. They were psychologically traumatic. And what would happen is because the immigration officials had caught on to this practice of paper sons and daughters, that often for Chinese, they were asked more questions. They had lengthier interrogations compared to other groups. For the Chinese, sometimes the interrogations could last days. They would be asked hundreds upon hundreds of questions. Things like, what direction does the window in your bedroom face? How many steps are in your ancestral home? What's the name of the neighbor who lives 3 doors down for you? What's the name of their dog? And these are all questions that they would match your answers with that of your alleged relative. And if your answers didn't match, then that was potentially raising suspicion and grounds for deportation. So again, 500,000 immigrants from 80 different countries, and these are just some historical photos that show the diversity of those immigrants. There aren't that many names that folks might recognize of people who were detained on Angel Island, but these 3, I thought, especially for this audience, might stand out. So I.M. Pei, right, world-renowned architect. I.M. Pei actually happened to come from a very wealthy family, so his stay on Angel Island was much briefer than for others. He was able to show that he had wealth, and thus he was able to leave relatively quickly, but he was detained on Angel Island for a few days. Tyrus Wong, that might be a name that you don't recognize, but you will definitely recognize his work. Show of hands again, how many of you have ever seen the Disney movie Bambi? Right? So those beautiful backdrops that we see in the movie Bambi are the result of Tyrus's work. And then the Begay family here on the right-hand side. There is a street here in Berkeley that is named after Kala Begay. And the Begay family was one of the first South Asian families that came through Angel Island. They were able to make their way through Angel Island, but unfortunately, once they tried to settle down here in Berkeley, their neighbors at the time barricaded their house and kept them from moving in. So they ended up relocating down to Southern California. So that's just a little bit about the history of Angel Island. And as you hear that history, I hope that it just reinforces the same level of emotion in me that is this piece about why was I never taught this history, especially if you identify as Asian or Pacific Islander or Native Hawaiian or as a person of color. We all deserve our histories to be seen and heard and recognized. And it's because that history was not recognized back then that after the site closed down in 1946 after World War II, it fell into disrepair. The US Army declared it as surplus resources, and so it came under the ownership of the state of California. In 1963, the California State Parks took over stewardship for the station, and the buildings were in truly bad shape. There were plans back in the early 1970s to just tear all these buildings down because, again, our histories weren't seen as important, and to make way for picnic tables and campsites. Fortunately, that didn't happen. So let me share a little bit with you about what it took to save the station. Part of what saved the station is carved into the detention barracks are over 200 poems written by the Chinese detainees that talk about their experience of the detention, their emotions, their frustrations, their determination. And it's these poems that helped secure historical landmark statuses for the building and for the site. The poems really allow us a glimpse into what it was like to live under detention, and the themes and emotions that are expressed in these poems are probably not that dissimilar from what immigrants experience today under detention. This is just a quick timeline. I won't go over every single thing on this timeline, but I do want to point out the picture that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. That is California State Park Ranger, the late California State Park Ranger, Alexander Weiss, who was a Jewish immigrant himself. Shortly after he started working at Angel Island State Park, he had heard rumors about the poems carved into the walls of the detention barracks. And so he went into these buildings and he saw these poems. And he knew that there was something special there, despite California State Park's plans to tear down these buildings. So he happened to be taking biology classes at San Francisco State from George Araki. And George Araki then contacted his colleagues in academia as well as in the community. Back in the early 1970s, this was where we saw the beginnings of the births of the Asian studies movement. And what happened then was this spreading of a commitment from community organizations, from academics, from community leaders to save these buildings. What ultimately ended up happening was George Araki connected with other community members and other academics such as Ronald Takaki here at UC Berkeley, Paul Chow, who was an engineer at the time, Chris Chow, who was a journalist, Connie Young Yu, who was another community leader, and together they formed the Angel Island Immigration Station Historical Advisory Committee that was given the charge by the state government to develop a report of recommendations on what to do with the station. In 1976, they issued that report, and it was so compelling that the state legislature immediately passed a bill that saved the station and even allocated an initial $250,000 to begin renovations. Over time, what has happened is in 1983, the Angel Island Immigration Station Historical Advisory Committee became the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, the organization I work for today, and it became my organization's charge to continue the renovation process. Since 1983, we have helped to raise over $40 million in public and private funding to save the station, to maintain it, and to uplift these histories and stories. And you see through the lines on this timeline some of the major bills that were passed both at the federal level as well as the state level to help fund this preservation. This has been a long journey and a long process. Again, the buildings were in horrendous condition, so much so that in 1999, the site was declared one of the most endangered historic places in the country. And it was that recognition that actually helped us gain the groundswell of momentum, the attention, the urgency to connect with policymakers, to connect with the general public, to connect with corporations, to raise the funds to be able to preserve these buildings. And through that process of raising these funds, we were able to do a major renovation starting in 2006 to 2009, where literally the detention barrack was pulled apart piece by piece so it could be retrofitted to be earthquake safe, as well as to address some of the wood damage and rot that happened, and then placed back together again. And then most recently, just earlier this year in January, we opened the former hospital building to the public for the first time. And this hospital building was in an even worse shape than the detention barracks. It took us 7 years and $15 million to renovate the hospital building, and we've reimagined it now as the Angel Island Immigration Museum. I'll show you a couple pictures of what it looks like in just a bit. But what I really want to take the opportunity to do now is for you to be able to hear directly from the source, from two of the people who were involved in the work of saving Angel Island, about the spirit, the gumption, the commitment that it took. And so I will pull up this video of Connie Young Yu and Chris Chow, who are two of the original founders of the Angel Island Immigration Station Historical Advisory Committee. And this was from an awards ceremony that we held earlier this year, where we recognized the two of them with a Spirit of Angel Island Award.
Heritage Board. Connie and Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
This is a thrilling moment. Thank you so much for Christopher Chow and myself. So, this is very precious. It's an honor to be representing ASHAC, accepting the Angel Island Immigration Station Heritage Award on this momentous occasion of the opening of the hospital. It was the Chinese detention barracks our committee fought to save so many years ago. I never dreamed that we'd be here at the opening of the new Immigration History Museum, which was once the hospital where our ancestors stayed, and to see that the granite monument that ASHAC installed at the site of the immigration station decades ago, standing on a high bluff overlooking the ocean like a beacon of hope. When Christopher Chow first gathered us, it was activists. Our group was called the China Cove Historical Committee, Advisory Committee. When we were gathered here, all that remained was the dilapidated detention barracks. There was no other evidence that this was an immigration station that operated 1910 to 1940, processing people from Asia, detaining Chinese for weeks, months, even years, like my grandmother. We knew, though, from our parents' and grandparents' stories of Island, that there was a legacy of torment, heartbreak, and struggle against racial injustice. Because we've always lived under the shadow of the exclusion law, the Chinese exclusion law of 1882, even to this day. We were excluded from citizenship, from immigration, but excluded from history. There was no evidence of our struggle. The evidence would be on this island. So we had to stop the demolition of the barracks. It was Alexander Weiss, a ranger, who first saw the writing on the walls by the beam of his flashlight and showed us the way. The California State Resolution by Senator John Foran launched ASHAC in 1974, and 2 years later, Christopher Chow, Paul Chow, Mark Lai, Philip Choi, Lawrence Ju, and I and others presented a report to the Department of Parks and Recreation, and the barracks were saved. The state legislature appropriated $250,000 to preserve and restore the site as a state monument. In the following years, the committee had access to the barracks to share the history with the community. Paul Chow was tireless in giving countless tours to civic and community groups, teachers and students. ASHAC educated the public to the significance of the site and instilled a sense of pride instead of shame for former detainees. In 1979, we commemorated Asian immigration through Angel Island with a ceremony unveiling a monument that honored those who came, were detained, and who conquered the barriers of exclusion laws. It was those incarcerated Chinese, those immigrants writing poems of protest and anguish, those who formed a Liberty Association, and those making legal appeals who should be remembered and honored. Their indelible words, those poems they carved on the walls, called out to us and moved us to action. We are forever grateful to the dauntless immigrants, you who resisted cruel and unjust laws, who would not give up. So in your memory, we as representatives of ASHAC accept this Immigrant Heritage Award. Your writing on the walls saved the immigration barracks and rewrote a chapter of American history. So, Christopher, would you add some more?
Thank you, Connie. Thank you to the Foundation, the State Parks Department, and to the National Park Service for assistance. I'm really humbled because I'm treading on the ground that my father came through in 1935 when he was detained here on Angel Island in the hospital for a couple of weeks. I had never heard of Angel Island. He never spoke of it. My mother, who's been here twice, never spoke of Angel Island until after I had attended a meeting of the East Bay Asians for Action and heard and saw a slideshow on the Angel Island Barracks by Professor Ron Takaki. And we learned then that the State Department of Arts had plans for turning this area into a picnic ground and demolishing the detention barracks. And we said, no, we've got to stop that. And immediately at that meeting, we organized an ad hoc committee to save the detention barracks. We organized a letter writing campaign. We outreached to our families and friends. And when I mentioned it to my mother and father, they said, oh yeah. But the experience here for them was so shameful, so humiliating, they never wanted to share it with me because they didn't want to discourage me from the American dream. 48 years ago, we issued the report and recommendations. We said, stabilize the immigration barracks. Hopefully, it will become a National Historic Landmark. Restore the barracks. But we never thought that we'd get the hospital here restored. We never thought that this would be an immigration museum. That's astounding. And it is a tribute, not only to the members of the Angel Island Immigration Historical Advisory Committee, whose members also included Henry Durr, Po Wong, George Leong Sui, Lawrence Ju, Mark Lai and Phil Choi, Paul Chow and myself. But it also is a tribute to the foundation that picked up where we left off, which was to save the station. And they, with Felicia and Catherine and Buck and others, now under the leadership of Ed.
Julianne.
Thank you. We are moving forward further into the 21st century, and we can now leave a legacy to our children, grandchildren, and whoever else comes through here, comes through this land. And I just want to say, well, at the risk of being redundant, but back 48 years ago, I had said, though it be made of wood, this is our Plymouth Rock, our Valley Forge, our Lincoln Memorial, our Manzanar. And in the name of our forebears, who built the railroad, who made the Central Valley fertile, and helped build America into what it is, we, on behalf of our forebears and everybody else in the country, reclaim Angel Island Immigration Station as our own for everyone, forever.
Thank you, thank you.
So really powerful words. Imagine what the impact of something you start could look like 40, 50 years from now. And that's the moment that we were able to celebrate with Chris Chow and Connie Young Yu. With the time that I have remaining, I want to take a little bit of an opportunity to take the history, our stories, our history, and remember that history's current realities, datas, they are all seen from or through the lens of different narratives. And so when it comes to Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander realities, the narratives that are often focused on are things like the perpetual foreigner, where it doesn't matter how long we or our communities or our families have lived here in the US, we're unfortunately seen as not being fully American. One of invisibility, where our histories, our stories, our data are missing from the entertainment industry. It's changed a little bit in recent years, but growing up, definitely the only roles I saw in the entertainment industry for an Asian man like me were to be a cook in a kitchen or a martial artist. Luckily, the entertainment industry is advancing. There's still room to grow. But especially in 25 years of working in public health, I would so often come across tables, charts, reports, and graphs that would say such and such disease by race ethnicity, but then the only races and ethnicities that were shown were Black, white, and Hispanic. The data for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, as well as for Native communities, was often missing. The model minority myth, that myth that all Asians are universally healthy, wealthy, and well-educated. And as entertaining as a movie as Crazy Rich Asians was, unfortunately, it doesn't do much to help from dismantling this myth and stereotype. Because what this myth and stereotype does is it actually makes it harder for those elements, those parts of our community that are struggling to get the resources that they need, and for the community-based organizations that are working to service them to get the resources and the funding and support. Because it's important to remember that the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community is a truly diverse community made up of 50 different ethnic groups that speak 100 different languages. And to collapse all of our histories and experiences under one general umbrella does a disservice to the richness, the diversity of these communities. The model minority myth is also pernicious because it was created to pit Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities against other racial ethnic communities. And then the final narrative is that of hypersexualization of Asian Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian women and the demasculinization of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander men. And unfortunately, this narrative has real-world consequences for our communities. So these narratives are the narratives, the lenses that Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities are often viewed through. And I challenge you, as you partake of news stories, as you watch different movies, as you go to your different classes, as you engage in your own research and study, how are you keeping an eye to ensuring that these narratives don't persist? And how are you helping to ensure that you're not helping to promote these narratives? And then finally, what I want to end with is just a quick glimpse to show you some beautiful pictures of what Angel Island looks like today, hopefully as incentive to come out and visit. This is the Detention Barracks Museum. And this is just one of the rooms where you can learn about history, exactly where it happened. This is the former hospital building that is now the Angel Island Immigration Museum. And as we were designing the exhibits for this museum, we were very, very focused on ensuring that the histories and stories we told were not just of Asian Pacific Islanders, were not just of people who came through Angel Island, but was more diverse and more inclusive of stories from immigrants from all around the world. Because that immigrant experience, regardless if you came through Angel Island or whether it's you who immigrated here or whether it was your parents or grandparents, there are common themes, there are common threads of experiences. And so my hope is that if you identify as an immigrant or a descendant of immigrants or an ally of immigrants, that you come and visit Angel Island's immigration station and you feel a sense of connection to the place and its histories. I'm not going to have time to show you this, but this is a virtual exhibit, and I believe we can if you go to actually www.cyark.org and just search for Angel Island Immigration Station, you'll be able to do a virtual visit of the immigration station, thanks to our friends at Angel Island State Park, as well as CYARK, which is another nonprofit organization. And so with that, let me just also plug one event that's coming up at the end of this month. One of the projects I've been working on in terms of storytelling is to develop a set of short animated videos that talk about the history of Angel Island, as well as other moments in Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander history. And so we're going to be debuting these videos on Thursday, September 29th. The web link to register for this free event is there on the screen. It's bit.ly/AIISF-29. Sorry, I need reading glasses, but I've been trying to avoid that. But with that, I just want to say thank you again to UC Berkeley, to Susan, and to the Futures History Lab for this opportunity to share a little bit with you about Angel Island's history and the efforts to preserve it. And I believe Susan and you and I are going to engage in some conversation and questions, and then open it up to questions from the group.
Great. Thank you so much. That was so interesting, and gave such a great picture, especially of, the 50 years of activism that it took to bring about this kind of hopefully permanent long-term storytelling. Can you tell us what your dreams are for the future of the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, and the stories and how they connect to other stories?
Thanks for that question, Susan. I have two dreams, two North Stars. One is that the history of Angel Island becomes common knowledge among every single household here in the US. And each of you can actually help take part in that if you take the opportunity to just talk with 3 people about what you learned today about Angel Island's history. And that's my ask of all of you watching, whether here in person or online, is to help spread the word about this important to remember history that unfortunately just remains unheard and invisible in so many places. My second hope for the future is that more people come to visit the Angel Island Immigration Station. Before the COVID pandemic, we would get about 20,000 visitors a year, which is great. And at the same time, when you compare that to the number of people who visit Alcatraz or who visit Ellis Island, it's a drop in the bucket for a place that is so meaningful and as memorable as Angel Island is.
Great. And so as you all formulate your questions, and we'll go to questions in just a second, I have one more question for Ed, which is about how, if students are interested in getting into this kind of work, what kind of roles are there at a historic state park in a nonprofit? What are the different skills they would need to participate in some way?
Yeah, there's so many different ways that you can be involved in this type of work. The foundation is not involved in the day-to-day operations or management of the site. That is the responsibility of Angel Island State Park. And so there are many roles at state parks, and I know that they are always looking for people who are interested in coming and working out on the island. If you work at Angel Island and you're a permanent employee, there's actually also opportunities to live on Angel Island, which is an amazing experience. One of the park staff there has actually lived and worked on the island for over 21 years. In the nonprofit sector, I have to admit that when I was in college, I never would have imagined that I'd be working in an organization or in the role like the one that I'm in now. I was on a pre-med track, and I realized after volunteering in an ER that I couldn't stand the sight of blood, so that kind of killed that career. But there is so much that is happening in terms of public health, in terms of community health, in terms of social justice and racial justice, where we have seen a number of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community-based organizations flourish, to address issues happening in our communities, and doing so in collaboration with communities from all around the spectrum. And so whether you are interested in management, whether you're interested in research, whether you're interested in storytelling, or in providing services directly to community, there are a number of different pathways and roles that you can play. For example, I studied biology and psychology in undergrad, but I'm now working in a nonprofit sector that is a historical organization. And so I would say that it doesn't matter what you study. I mean, that is a very helpful basis. But what is perhaps even more important is finding your sense of self, finding your voice, so that when you are in situations where you see an injustice happening, where you see something wrong, you have the confidence and you have the ability to speak up in a way that changes people's minds and can help change the course of history the same way that our founders and co-founders of ASHAC did to help preserve the buildings at Angel Island.
Thanks. And I also want to let students know that later in the semester in November, Elizabeth Fair is going to speak, and she was an interpretive specialist at Angel Island for 2 years, and her experiences there inspired her to pursue a PhD in art history here at Berkeley so that she could dig more deeply into the poetry and the buildings that she was being a tour guide for. So I think that'll be an interesting and inspiring talk for you all. So any questions?
There's one down here. Here, why don't you borrow mine?
Alrighty, so this is a question from the Zoom audience, and the question is, how do you think most people find out about Angel Island today?
Interesting question. I think a number of different ways. We do still have a number of students who come out to Angel Island during the school year, especially 4th and 5th graders, who take guided tours of the station. And what's been really beautiful to see is that that has been such a meaningful experience that they come back with their families, and you have this opportunity for intergenerational dialogue. I hope that as Asian American studies becomes a little bit more prominent across the country, and as more states and cities and school districts are passing new laws and curriculum improvements to include not just Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander histories, but all of our country's important. As these curriculum standards get passed, that will provide more of an opportunity for people to learn about Angel Island as well. What has been challenging is that I know that social media is a key way of connecting with folks right now, and that is something that we're still dipping our toes into. We have a Facebook channel, we have a YouTube channel, a Twitter channel. We don't have TikTok just yet, but Instagram as well. And so that's also just another way that all of you can help to spread the word and help people learn about Angel Island, is by tagging us and coming out and visit when you take pictures, just so that people can see what is out there, because it truly is a meaningful place.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful presentation. I have 2 questions. First, who named the island Angel? And the second question is, I grew up here, so I always go from the ferry in Tepporn, and the one time I went to Alcatraz was actually when Native Americans took it over, and we went over to do morning blessings there. Is there a ferry from San Francisco that goes to the Angel Island?
I think this is working now. Can everyone hear me? Great. So it was the Spanish that actually named Angel Island, because when you think about its history of immigration and detention now, Angel definitely is a little bit of a misnomer. But the Spanish discovered, quote unquote, Angel Island on one of the Catholic days, which was the Day of the Angels. And so that's what lends to its name of being called Angel Island. In terms of ferry options, so yes, Tepporn is one of the ways that you can get to Angel Island. For folks who have any type of motion sickness, it's a shorter ferry ride. It's only 10 minutes, and so that is a nice option. We are very lucky, too, that we still have ferry service from San Francisco to Angel Island. One of the previous companies who had serviced that route had put in an application to permanently end the route, which would have meant that there would have been no ferry service from San Francisco to Angel Island, which to me is equivalent to saying that there's no ferry service from New York to the Statue of Liberty or Ellis Island. It would have just been very egregious. But luckily, the Golden Gate ferry service took over the route, and so there is still ferry service from the ferry building in downtown San Francisco to Angel Island.
And it's wonderful because you can take public transit, you can take BART to Embarcadero and then pop on the ferry in San Francisco and then get over to Angel Island. So it's more accessible now. So, well, we have to wind up our time here, but before we say thank you to Ed, I want to let everybody know that next week we're going in a slightly different direction. We are going to be looking at 3 Japanese-American female artists, Miki Hayakawa, Hisako Hime, and Mine Okubo. And Professor Sherpu Wang from UC Merced, an art historian, is going to be talking about these artists who worked both before and after World War II. And what we're looking at there is the ability of people to represent themselves. These artists worked through portraiture. And so it was a chance to not be seen and represented through the eyes of others, but to represent themselves. And the other thing that we're going to be looking at is that, you know, the history of immigration is not just of incarceration and suffering and discrimination. There is a lot of joy, there's a lot of everyday life. There are many things that we need to be looking at, and particularly in the case of Japanese American history, it's, you know, the stories of the U.S. concentration camps, Manzanar, Rower, Heart Mountain, all those places that are so important to remember and so important as constitutional stories to be told. They're not the only story. And so we're going to be hearing some new stories about folks that are less known. And I'm really looking forward to this talk next week with Sherpu Wang, who will be in conversation with Professor Atriyi Gupta, who is a professor of art history here at UC Berkeley. So thank you so much, Ed, for a really wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan.
And so any students who want to sign the thank you card for Joe Chan, please come up and we'll meet in the lobby so that we can clear out the classroom. Thanks.